guess I should give some thank yous. First, I guess I'd like to thank everyone in this room for being part of the Illinois PF community. Without you, none of this happens. I'd like to thank my team, Lauren, Mikey, Liam, Haley, Mara, Kenna. I think I said all of you. I'm a bad teammate. Thank you guys for being the best teammates and scrimmaging us all the time. I'd like to thank my coaches, mainly Steve, for giving me his wife for the past 3 weeks, 5 hours a day, just to make this round possible. I'd like to thank Andres for being our bus, for driving us all across the country, just to go to the middle of Nebraska and taking us to some park in Iowa that we might have died in. But most importantly, I'd like to thank my parents for being here today. Without you, your love, your support, and all the money you've given up to send this kid all the way around the country, nothing's possible without you. I thank my coach for taking some annoying freshmen 4 years ago and Franking Steiner into what she calls one of her greatest creations. Krapel, thank you for everything you do. Thank you for giving up time with your family just to coach Burke and I. Then I'd like to thank Burke for being the best partner I could ever ask for. I wouldn't want to debate this round with anyone else. Win or lose, you'll still hate me. Bill and Michael, we've called this round from the beginning of the year. Now it's finally happening. Let us begin. We affirm that resolve. The United States should promote the development of market rate housing in urban neighborhoods. Important definition. We define the promotion of market rate housing as the deregulation of barriers that prevent encouraging housing development. This is because currently regulation exists, and market rate housing is housing with the absence of price regulation. Contention 1 is institutional barriers. Currently, there are substantial structural barriers against housing development for the poor, pushing them to subsidized homes. This phenomenon occurs for 3 unique reasons, all of which are mitigated by market rate promotion. First is financial incentive. The Journal of Economic Perspectives of 2018 explains that cities have a financial incentive to underproduce housing units. This is because cities want to have a high jobs to housing ratio, bring in incomes from claiming businesses and their taxes, while decreasing the amount of residents who heavily use public services. This is especially true for lower income housing, because people with lower incomes use public services at an expedited rate. Instead, cities unfairly push lower income people into impoverished neighborhoods to avoid what they see as a burden. By developing market rate housing in urban areas, you avoid pushing lower income people into bad conditions by disregarding the self-serving interest of locality. Second is racist regulation. The Washington Monthly in 2018 explains that existing homeowners are afraid of building more homes that might bring minorities into the neighborhood. In fact, because of these factors, neighborhood groups have been able to successfully organize against housing development. In turn, this means that public and subsidized housing has been promoted as a way to allow housing opportunity for minorities. The only action the government can take to promote market rate housing is to deregulate. By doing so, you remove the discriminatory power of these groups that the current legislation allows. Third is regulatory cost. The San Diego Tribune in 2015 found that government regulation may explain 40% of the high cost of new built housing. Essentially, the question of this debate is a question of whether or not to keep the same structural barriers that degrade housing access. With a vote for pro, you change and with the dehumanizing regulation that has led to the current housing instability in the first place. Contention 2 is perpetual poverty. Promoting the development of market rate housing keeps low-income people out of government subsidized housing. This is good for 3 reasons. First, subsidized units have worse conditions than comparable market rate units. Public and subsidized housing is in isolation and in need of drastic investment. For a real-world example, look at New York City, where many are in need of drastic investment. There's Castle Hill House in the Bronx, which has 5,000 residents and needs $23 million of immediate repairs according to the New York Times. But furthermore, public housing apartments have been plagued by rampant and recurring mold caused by unchecked leaks and moisture, adding to the health issues of tenants. Second, subsidized units lead to entrenched cycles of poverty. The Arizona State Law Journal in 2018 concludes that public and subsidized housing have historically led to ghettoization, inequitable aid distributions, neighborhood decline, and fiscal drain. Right now, cities only look to wealthy areas for investment. Jacob 16 states, a policy of only building housing for the wealthy is essentially a policy of only investing in wealthy neighborhoods. The remaining neighborhoods are allowed to deteriorate until they reach a point where they are politically and economically weak enough for the market to claim them as cheap. This is furthered by Lineberger 18, who finds that being priced out of urban neighborhoods decreases job access 3 to 5 times. Third is environmental damage. This is because affordable units are further away from the city center. EDF furthers that urban development decreases commutes, decreasing air pollution. And Lineberger 18 confirms that moving households into urban neighborhoods cuts greenhouse gas emissions by 50 to 80%. The promotion of market rate housing uniquely solves for these 3 issues. As the NRE states, investment will be in low-income housing. There is a growing investor interest in lower price point product, including properties at the lower end of the price spectrum. Market rate development means affordable development. Furthermore, voting con and continuing the trend of regulation makes the issue worse. A study by Stanford's James McQuaid in 2018 found the rental housing supply decreases by 15% as a result of expansion of price regulation. Remember, we live in the con world. When voting con, you are entirely complacent with the classism and racism that plagues the housing market. However, when you affirm, you prevent a perpetual cycle of structural violence being exacerbated further. Thus, you vote pro.
So I can't speak as eloquently as John here, but I'd like to thank a couple of people. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone from my PF team as well. Of course, Michael, who has been one of my best friends for 6 years and counting. Matthew, Nikhil, oh my gosh, Robert, my own, Sharon, Miguel, and Andrew, thank you for being here today and performing wonderfully. I'd like to thank my parents who are not here today, and even though they don't know anything about debate, they told me to do my best and have fun, at the least, which I did have tons of fun. I'd like to thank my coaches. I'd like to thank Sonny, who has been here a huge help for the state season. And once again, I'd like to thank our competitors, who, yes, we've decided to meet here, and I'm glad you guys kept the promise. With that being said, Michael ready? Yes. Opponents ready? Yeah. Judges ready? Let's begin. We negate, resolved. The United States should promote the development of market rate housing in urban neighborhoods. Contention 1 is that deregulation limits affordable housing. First, private companies rarely build affordable units. Richard Florida from the University of Toronto School of Cities explains how money poured into housing markets has not significantly increased supply, but rather increased ultra-high-end units. However, a 2017 Harvard analysis explains how new high-end apartments became more difficult to fill. 10% of high-end rentals remained vacant after a year, but only 2% of low-cost units were still unfilled. Low-cost rents rose 3.1%, reflecting the strong demand for lower-cost housing. Policy reporter Jeff Stein explains the flawed logic is in securing the market for market rate housing. Cities approved thousands of new luxury units, hoping to check high rents that led 20 million renters to be cost-burdened. Badger of the Washington Post reported how this has not happened. Since 2011, developers bought 2,000 low-income units in Chicago for high-end conversion. However, rent now costs twice as much there. This is also happening in LA, New York, and Washington. Now Chicago is trying to save 6,000 other remaining units, a small fraction of what once was a last resort for the poor. If for-profit owners wanted to purchase and preserve these buildings as affordable housing, theoretically they could have, but none of them have. This is why Stein concludes, direct government action is needed to prevent poor residents from being forced out. Kimmelman of the New York Times shows how this has happened in the neighborhood of Hackney. Hackney has been upgrading its public housing projects. The community's council, not some private developer, was in charge, and this is key, because 430 aged subsidized apartments are now being replaced by 925 new ones, increasing the number of subsidized units. Clearly, we see that public projects are the ones sustaining low-rent housing. However, affirming ties the government's hands because promoting market rate housing and pushing for deregulation puts renovations in the hands of the private industry, which places profits before the welfare of the vulnerable. Negating has two main impacts. The first is better quality of life. Affordable housing developments in poor, heavily black communities lead to less crime and greater racial and income integration, according to new research by Stanford economists. Negate to help the socioeconomically disadvantaged. The second impact is reducing homelessness. According to the Journal of Urban Affairs, a study of over 300 cities showed that an increase of $100 in median rent corresponded to a 15% increase in the homeless population. The conversion of subsidized units into market rates skyrockets prices, directly leading to homelessness. Negate to keep the vulnerable off our streets. Contention 2 is that market rate development causes segregation and inequality. First, new market rate homes will always be expensive in urban areas. Flanagan in 2018 states how the density of existing cities means that there's a limited supply of undeveloped land for building. It comes at a steep price, meaning developers maximize profits through higher-end units. In cities, any new unit becomes costlier to construct. Thus, classic supply-demand fails because expensive, limited land pushes rents up. The economically disadvantaged are harmed as a result. Amy Chu in 2018 writes that market rate housing construction fuels displacement because it drives up rents, burdening lower income households. Neighborhoods renovated with market rate housing become too costly for poor and black families, while those left alone breed poverty. Ellie Anzalotti states, pockets of entrenched racialized poverty, which historically housed poor black people, are largely vacant, pulling investment away from schools and transit. In historically white neighborhoods, empty lots spell opportunity to developers, but in historically poor black neighborhoods, they spell disinvestment. Now this has two main impacts. One is that dilapidated housing is a downward spiral. Richard Florida shows us that vacancy rates increased 80% in small cities and 60% in large cities. High vacancy devalues entire neighborhoods, breeding drug abuse, violence, and crime rates that are twice as high. Poor housing is socially costly, and that's why we negate. Our second impact is perpetuating generational poverty. Jamel Bowie explains how African Americans are most likely to live in substantially impoverished neighborhoods, as 66% born between 1985 and 2000 live in neighborhoods as poor as those of their parents. Moreover, a child born impoverished has a 64% chance of moving down the income ladder in their lifetime. The persistence of poor generations is transmitted from one generation to the next, and thus for all of these reasons, negate.
You just want to do cross. You just want to do cross the table.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, my first question, Bill.
Yeah, go ahead.
Your impact about homelessness tells me that for every $100 increase in rent, there's like a 50 for every 50. Okay, so like, can you give me a city where there's been like a $100 increase in rent?
Okay, so it's empirically seen because the only reason why they came to this conclusion about a $100 increase in rent is because they studied over 300 cities examining the results of that.
Okay, so can you give me one of those cities?
Okay, I can't give you a specific city because there are 300 of them.
Okay.
I can list out any city and like out of the 383 metro areas, I'm sure one of those
So
is.
how many of them saw the 15% increase in homelessness take place?
Yes. What?
How many of them saw that take place?
How many of them saw that take place?
Yeah.
It was once again a national study, so I can't tell you exactly which cities are experiencing this increase. Some are lower, some are greater.
Okay,
That's
you have
it.
a question.
All right, may I have a question? All right.
Yeah.
So, all right, 1 second. So under your definition, which regulations do you believe will be removed through promotion?
Okay, so the HUD tells you that the regulations that will be removed are regulations that affect the fair market value. If you guys want to call for the card, you can. It's just like a bunch of regulations that affect fair market
Okay,
value.
so does that not include like inclusionary zoning laws and stuff like that?
I mean, I couldn't tell exactly what the HUD evidence says, but the HUD evidence tells you that it like removes regulations that affects the fair market price. If you guys want to see it, call for it.
No, that's fine. All right, go ahead.
All right, so let's go down to your impact about like vacancy rates.
Okay.
So if vacancy rates aren't, okay, so like, in what cities are like we seeing these like high vacancy rates?
Okay, so these high vacancy rates are taken, like, for example, from St. Louis, where gentrification has actually pulled people who can get out of these poor neighborhoods into these areas, which makes their lives better. But this leaves behind even more people in these impoverished neighborhoods. And because these impoverished neighborhoods are even worse off, there's even less investment in them.
So can I ask a quick follow-up?
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Yeah, so does St. Louis have like any type of like rent control program? Or are they like a market rate?
Regardless of what's happening, like the market rate construction within these gentrified areas is going to lead to more individuals being impoverished and stuck in poverty in even worse conditions. You have a question?
Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about your impact of reducing greenhouse gases. You say 50 to 80% of greenhouse gases are going to be reduced in total. How is that possible simply by commuting?
It's like per person. So like each person will reduce their like greenhouse gas footprint by 50 to 80%.
Okay, and how much of a footprint do these low-income individuals already have
So
right
like,
now?
I would contend that lower income individuals right now in the status quo have higher greenhouse footprints. This is because like we read you from the evidence in our second warrant that tells you that public and subsidized housing is historically led in isolated areas farther away from the city center.
Okay, so how many of these people commute through something that would emit greenhouse gases?
I mean, like people who like drive to work every day, like that type of stuff.
All right.
All right, let's go down to your impact about. Okay, so like in LA, New York, you tell me that like rents are skyrocketing.
Yes.
Don't they have like regulation, like rent control, so decrease rents?
Yes, and we're going to be losing that in the future
So,
because right
but
now
if
they're transitioning to market
rents
rates.
are skyrocketing.
Rents are yes.
Okay.
Because there is not enough affordable housing projects being created. What these developers are focusing on right now is actually increasing the amount of luxury units.
Perfect, that's fine. Take some prep. Hold on, can I pull my timer? All right. We're starting prep now. I have 6 seconds used.
Okay. Yep.
Oh my god, I forgot. Thank you to John. Thanks Krapel and Steve. Thanks our team. Thanks you guys. Thanks to the judges too. Okay. By some goodwill. Okay, so the roadmap's gonna go, I'm gonna give one response that's gonna apply to their entire case, and then I'm just gonna go line by line down their case. Partner ready?
Yes.
Opponents ready?
Yep.
And are all 5 judges ready? Okay. Let's begin. You can buy their entire case, but you still vote for us. This is because even if market rate is bad, the alternative is worse. The crucial thing to keep in mind when looking at a large policy decision, such as the one being discussed in this topic, is that every decision must be made in context of its alternatives. This debate isn't simply if market rate housing is good or bad, but if a world with more is preferable to a world with less. And this is really important because public housing, which is the alternative, cannot solve by itself. Feldman in 2018 quantifies that even if governments had subsidized public homes at quadruple the current rate, we would still be short over 20,000 units. State and city budgets will not fund buildings of a subsidies of a magnitude that would be needed to reduce the needed units. And that's really crucial because you need market rate housing to fill the shortage. Let's go into their first contention where they talk about how deregulation limits affordable housing. First of all, they tell you that it is only going to lead to more luxury units. I'm going to have 2 different responses. Now, first, this is only because we live in an over-regulated world. You can cross-apply our third warrant in our first contention, where we tell you that 40% of the cost of newly built housing is because of government over-regulation. When you vote pro, you remove that barrier and make affordable housing easier to produce. But second, you can cross-apply with the NREI evidence that we give you in our second contention. We explain to you that when you deregulate the market, you're going to see an increased investment in lower price point properties, literally more investment into lower income properties with a pro ballot. Next, they talk about how the people are buying up properties and converting them. But this is only because luxury is profitable in the quo. We would contend that actually when you vote pro, prices get cheaper with a pro ballot for 3 different reasons. The first is because market rate housing actually lowers property values. Bertolet in 2016 finds that new market rate housing tends to lower rather than raise the value of nearby properties because there's more of them available in a specific location. But second is through deregulation. Sholey in 2015 quantifies that government regulation may explain some 40% of the high cost of newly built housing. We give this to you in case. But the third and most important is the real world impact. Feldman in 2018 finds that the greatest source of new affordable housing comes from existing market rate houses that have become cheaper over time. Their impact is displacement. We would say that you should turn this impact to our side. This is because market rate housing development solves displacement. Hertz in 2016 finds empirically that changing from a low construction neighborhood to a high construction neighborhood was associated with a decline in the probability of displacement by 20%. But for a real world example, look to Portland and Seattle, where Mark Wright of the Star Tribune in 2018 finds that thousands of new market rate apartments have lowered rents in previously existing properties. If the new market rate apartments had not been built, new arrivals to these cities would have competed for older and cheaper units. This would have bid up prices, displaced current residents, and reduced the supply of affordable homes. So we can see that on both their impacts, first of all, quality of life, you can apply our net offense. Their alternative is affordable housing, which is worse than market rate housing. And their second is homelessness. I give you 3 different reasons why you prefer prices on a pro side rather than con side. Their second contention is talking about segregation and inequality. Now, first of all, you can cleanly turn this by cross-applying with our second contention. The problem is that subsidized housing in the status quo has led to this. The reason we would prefer our analysis over theirs is because we quantify. We tell you that because subsidized housing is further away from the city center, you decrease job access by 3 to 5 times. This is what's leading them into a poverty trap. And remember that the con side doesn't change anything. My second response is going to be that we live in a con world. All they do is point out the problem. If you want the solution, then you vote pro. This is really important because Weiss in 2018 finds that more than 90% of public housing is around the same price as rents already offered by the local housing market. But the difference is explained by Bertolet in 2016, which finds that you would lose an average of 13 new market rate units for every 1 public unit saved. This is really important. You see an increased supply on our side, and that is nearly the same prices on their side, if not cheaper. But what's really important is that this leads us into the narrative of our second contention, because subsidized housing is empirically worse. Marcisco in 2017 explains that the poorest segment of our society lives in public or assisted housing today, and the fact that housing is typically located in an isolated, racially segregated, and underserved neighborhood has created hardship for those living there who are mostly minorities. This cycle of structural violence that we talk about in case is something endemic to the con world. You can get rid of this cycle of structural violence by voting pro. We can see that we can turn both their impacts, because where the only world where the housing is bad is where you don't have new housing with a con ballot, and the perpetual poverty impact is literally existent only in their world. Thank you, and for these reasons, I urge you to vote pro.
Alright, just to give a couple thank yous. I'd like to, of course, thank Bill for being my best friend for the last half decade, I guess, and being a great debate partner, even though you did Congress for 3 years. I'd like to thank John and Burke for first calling this match 9 months ago, and also being great opponents throughout the year. And I'd also like to thank my team and my coaches for being very supportive through the entire process, and Z for not kicking me off the team ever. And my parents too, yeah, for coming out and coming back. All right. Bill, you ready?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. To give a brief off-time roadmap, we're going over a couple main ideas, an overview, a couple main ideas they brought up in their rebuttal, and then going line by line. Bill, you ready?
Yeah.
Opponents ready?
Yeah.
Judges ready?
Wait, where should we pull the overview?
Okay. Opponents ready.
Okay.
Judges ready? All right. Let's begin. You're going to start off by flowing through a Larry Moore card showing the average family in the bottom 20% of the income distribution has less than $500 left after paying rent. This is crucial because they have no money left after necessities to actually afford more rent. Therefore, if there's any increase in the rent today, you're going to be voting for the con side. Now, a couple of main ideas they brought up. First off, on this idea of filtering, the entire linkage they have to affordable housing in their case is through filtering. You're going to look to Miriam Zook, who explains filtering rates have an inverse relationship with housing price inflation. In other words, places with rapidly rising housing prices have slower filtering rates. When we increase market rate housing promotion, we're going to decrease filtering and decrease the production of affordable homes. This is crucially important. The final thing you're going to be looking at is the reason and the warranty behind the luxury unit idea. Daniel Harridge's Master's in Urban Development from the University of Minnesota details there are two reasons why developers build luxury market rates regardless of the demand. First is that the floor on home prices is ultimately set up by the actual cost of building new houses. As its land price goes up, they're going to be more expensive. The second is through hidden costs of development. They can be time delays as well as materials and stuff like this. This means that as more things get expensive, it's going to cause more rents to go up. This means that luxury rents are going to be continued to be sold because the only way to make a profit is through luxury ideas. Now, to their case, the first thing, the definition of promotion, they talk about deregulation. You're going to have to hold them accountable for this throughout the debate. You're going to make sure that when they say deregulation, it's deregulation. Don't let them cherry pick the regulations they want to get rid of. The idea is through inclusionary zoning laws, which are also lost because inclusionary zoning laws demote market rate housing because it forces people to build affordable housing alongside the market rate housing. This is going to be taken away, and that's their other link to affordable housing. It's gone. Now, their first contention about the institutional barriers. They give three warrants. The first one is these financial ideas. You're first going to look at the idea understanding that basically these financial regulations aren't going to be impacted. In the long term, when we see just market rate housing, because these houses are luxury, that's going to mean that the increase in prices is greater than the financial barriers they're talking about currently. The second one they give you is racist regulations. You're going to understand that racism is not going to be going away regardless. If it's xenophobic now from the developers, it's still going to be xenophobic from the people in these neighborhoods. That's not going to change. It's just going to make them be unable to afford these neighborhoods because it's luxury units and because the units are more expensive. The third one they give you is regulatory costs. They talk about how there's this 40% of this portion of the cost is actually a result of the market of the effects of affordable housing and the government regulations. You're going to look at this a couple ways. You're going to flow through our Flanagan card and our Florida card, showing you that it's going to be luxury units and the shortage of land supply. That means that these market rate units are going to be crucially and critically expensive. This means it's going to actually be greater than the slight amount affordable costs have. The idea of rent control is to keep rents down. It works. That's why it's called affordable housing. The other way you're going to look at it is because in general, we're going to be increasing the economy overall. You're going to look at the idea that the lack of affordable housing options in just 3 cities cost the U.S. economy $1.6 trillion. You're going to see the idea that this $1.6 trillion, as a result of increased affordable housing, is actually going to be helping all people, including these people who are rent burdened. Now, to their second contention about perpetual poverty. First, they talk about this idea of the public housing being worse condition. You're first going to look at the idea that you can't evaluate what you can't see. If you're buying their idea of gentrifying these neighborhoods, it's going to be causing these people to be priced out because of the increased rents through our Florida card. It's going to be more expensive. When the neighborhood is looking better, it's because there's higher ability and higher quality of housing, but this also means that these poor people are not able to access these neighborhoods. That's things like Caribbean, that's things like our St. Louis example from our case. The next thing they talk about is this idea of the cycle of poverty. What you're going to look at is basically, the cycle of poverty is going to be perpetuated. The link they have here to ending the cycle of poverty comes through affordable housing programs, which they lose the link to. Inclusionary zoning laws, which force affordable housing along market rate housing, is gone under deregulation. The other way, which is through filtering, it's completely mitigated because when you promote market rate housing, you decrease the rate of filtering, and second off, because filtering ends up filtering up, which makes it more expensive in the long run. The third thing they talk about is this environmental damage. You're going to first be mitigating this because just 100 companies are the source of more than 70 of the world's greenhouse gases. Sure, they're making a little bit of dent in their actual greenhouse gases, but this is nothing on the global scale. And the second way is that they don't actually prove to you that these jobs are in the middle of the city. They simply say they are traveling further to the inner city. Make them prove to you that all these jobs are in the inner city and that there's an actual quantifiable impact in this. And for these reasons, you can only see a con ballot in today's debate. Thank you.
Can we run some prep before cross?
Just a moment.
We'll run like 10 seconds. Starting. Okay, now. All right, I have a minute 48 left. All right.
We're doing up there?
Yeah. By the count goggles.
Of course. Yeah, you can see.
All right.
You can have the first questions.
Yeah.
All
so-
judges ready?
where in our case do we mention filtering?
Okay, so it was in your rebuttal. Your rebuttal mentioned this in, I believe it was your tax.
Yeah, okay, so the third reason why it's cheaper.
Yes.
But how does that now knock out our entire case?
Well, no, the idea is it knocks out your link to affordable housing.
So we provide 3 different links to affordable housing, and like we would argue that the problem is that we aren't going to be building luxury housing with a pro val. Like we tell you that there's investor interest in building lower price point products.
That is actually empirically not seen. What we can see currently is that first off, through the Harvard card, there is little demand for luxury housing, which is going to continue to in the pro world. But despite that, we're still seeing these high luxury units being built. And this is because this is warranted through the Flanagan card with the lack of land, as well as through
yeah,
other
we'll get to that in siege.
Sure.
You can ask questions.
Yes, so you talked about how, can you just explain to me the warranty behind the loss of 13 houses for the one you talked about? I think it was 13 market rate loss for one affordable.
So subsidized housing is actually like notoriously badly run. They basically ineffectively use resources. The cost for one affordable unit is approaching nearly $250,000 per unit. This is vastly more expensive.
Sure. Can you just get to the warranty then?
It's more expensive.
So it's 13 times more expensive.
And cities don't tend to effectively utilize their resources to rebuild subsidized units.
All right, we'll see that card afterwards. You can take a question.
Okay, so let's talk about, So segregation and equality. How does the con help this?
All right, so what we're seeing is the reason these people are segregated is because either they're in these neighborhoods that are left behind, or they're just simply like not able to access housing. And so the way the con solves for this is because, the con isn't actually the one solving it. We're showing that the pro perpetuates this.
Okay.
This is seen because the pro ballot perpetuates market rate housing. Market rate housing has been linked to luxury housing through our 3 warrants,
Yep.
and that means that it's going to cause there to be increase. While the neighborhoods may become more like better looking, but this is going to price the people out because of increased rents. The other way we're going to see it is that old neighborhoods are left behind. These poor neighborhoods, we see this with the same example in our case. You leave them behind, they don't get better. All right, thank you. So you talk about how market rate housing lowers, like, you basically said like there's a shortage of housing for these poor people, and market rate's the solution. But like, if market rate's going to be more expensive, how is this at any way?
So we would completely disagree that market rate is going to be more expensive unless you want to provide a quantification of that. So first of all, we say that the largest housing supply, the largest affordable housing supply is literally market rate. And second of all, like if you're gonna argue that subsidized housing is trade-off, you never respond to the attack that I give, the response that I give at the very top of my rebuttal, which explains that there's never going to be able to have enough subsidized housing to make up for the gap with market rate. You always need to be promoting market rate housing if you want people if you want low-income people to have housing.
But in the status quo, there's market rate and there's subsidized. There's no reason we have to get rid of subsidized, which is beneficial to these people because of the low rents, and there's a slight burden on the state, whereas we can have the market rate instead.
We would argue that because what we tell you with the Weiss evidence is that most affordable housing, like 90% of it, is around the same price of that offered by the market already. At that point, like there isn't an advantage of living in a subsidized apartment other than you live in a poverty trap that's further away from the city center, less jobs, and you're in a disadvantaged state.
We're just continue running traffic.
Roadmap, definition, down the con. Then we're going to be introducing the 2 places on the flow you will be affirming. Is everyone ready?
Yeah.
Let's begin. Starting with our definition, Michael gets up here and says, hold us accountable like you're going to lose inclusionary zoning. No, the only things you're going to lose are things that affect the fair market rent, like rent controls, but Bergen are going to tell you that on net, this is bad. Let's go to my opponent's case. On their first contention about deregulation, first, where you can literally increase subsidized homes by 4 times if you're still 20,000 units short in every single state. You need market rate housing to solve that for the shortage. But second, let's extend a few terms they never respond to. First, remember that market rate housing decreases property values. This is important in the context of today's round because we're both talking about helping low-income people. So market rate housing decreases property values. That means you're going to increase access for people at the lower end of the socioeconomic scale. But second, remember that we tell you from Fremd that the greatest source of new affordable housing is market rate housing that becomes cheaper over time. You want to have more affordable housing, you have to affirm. But on to their second contention about segregation. Remember that we tell you that 90% of public housing has the same cost of market rate housing, but when you affirm, you get 13 times more housing. This is important because remember, when you affirm, you remove people out of government subsidized homes, breaking the poverty trap that is currently taking place in the status quo. Let's go into the voters. The first voter issue in this round is going to be cost. They get up here in rebuttal and tell you basically you're only building luxury units. The only reason that luxury units are being built right now in the status quo is because of regulation. Remember that we tell you that regulation increases the cost by 40%. But when you affirm, you do 2 things. First, you decrease the cost, because when you affirm, you remove the regulations that are increasing the cost, so you decrease by 40%. But second, you increase the supply, because the McQuaid evidence that they never respond to in rebuttal tells you that regulation decreases supply 15%. When you affirm, you reverse this. Prefer this argument for 2 reasons. First, on scope, because we increase supply. Second, because we remove the institutional barriers that are discriminatory in the status quo, contributing to structural violence. The second voter issue in today's round is going to be poverty. They get up here and tell you that we have no link, and we lose the link to the programs when we deregulate. That is the exact point of the argument. The programs that are happening in place right now in the status quo lead to ghettoization and equitable aid distributions, but you can affirm the NRE evidence they never respond to in rebuttal tells you that you're going to see an increase in investment in low-income housing means you take people out of the poverty trap, breaking the cycle.
We'll take voting prep time, please.
No, not the clubhouse. Supposed to support a thing in round.
So as a brief off-time roadmap, we'll be addressing the 2 main voting issues of today, explaining why the con has won. All right. So, Michael, ready?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, sir. Judges ready? I'm sorry.
Bill.
There's no good way to put
Just wear them.
All right, so let's get that out of the way. So let's start with the definition, which means that we lose all regulation. And this is an inherently bad situation because inclusionary zoning laws would also be lost in the process. And inclusionary zoning is anti-market rate because you have to build affordable houses. Now, our first voting issue then is making renovations unaffordable. Our Harvard card shows that there are more vacancies in luxury homes compared to low-cost units. This shows that there's clearly no financial incentive right now to cater to the poor because they're still building luxury units even though there's not much demand for it. We agree that moving low construction to high construction reduces displacement. But this is only when construction is affordable. This is only achieved by regulation. And this is shown through our badge card, showing how Chicago, LA, New York, and Washington all see their subsidized units being wiped out and thus rents double. And this also shows that filtering will be slowed in the future because of its inverse relationship with rent costs. The Journal of Urban Affairs card finds that raising rents by $100 increases homelessness by 15%. So even if our opponents claim that people are being pushed into lower income areas, this is far better than the alternative of having no home. Now weigh this against their first contention of barriers. Now there are issues in the status quo, but all issues are caused by market rate housing. Pro accelerates every problem in the status quo, and thus we win on risk because there's a high risk of homelessness and deaths involved within our vulnerable, and a lack of regulation decreases new and existing affordable homes. Now let's look to our second voting issue, which is segregation and inequality. quality. Remember our finding card showing that limited land supply, not regulation costs, is the reason why these prices are shoved up. You would not sell a home, you would not sell an $800 home on $200 land for anything less than $1,000. Understand that racism will always exist in private development, and that's why our Ancelotti card shows that poor black neighborhoods are still largely vacant and lack investment. Under deregulation, no more forces ensure that affordable housing is built, namely inclusionary zoning. So weigh this against our opponent's contention about perpetual poverty. Turn this to our side, because yes, the poorest people live in public housing because it's the only affordable option. All other market rate options are far more for the luxury units. Greenhouse gases are also mitigated because the carbon footprint of poor individuals is minimal compared to business emissions, and thus we win on magnitude because we greater harm the minorities through affirming.
You guys got the first question. Let's get the second.
All right. Everyone ready for grand?
Yeah.
All right, let's begin.
You tell me a place like New York City and Los Angeles with losing subsidized units every day.
Yeah.
Why?
Because like people are purchasing from the private developers. That's the issue.
We see them being converted from affordable units into market rate units.
How many?
We can give you the card if you want to after Crossfire.
So like there's no number specifically on LA, but we do show you empirically in Chicago that 2,000 units are being like rented out, or not rented out, they're being bought and converted for high-end development.
Okay.
And this has led to rent increases.
You guys can ask questions.
Okay. All right. So then, under a pro world, what would incentivize these private developers who care about generating the most profit from even entering these poorer neighborhoods?
So I get that it seems counterintuitive. They would want to invest in lower income properties, but the opposite is true. When you remove the regulations, they actually have more incentive to invest in lower income properties because now it is profitable. While
Okay,
you
so
might not make as much income per property because the rents aren't as big, considering that there are more low income people than there are high income people, you garner a larger profit in the long run and on scope.
Right. So which regulations exist in low-cost neighborhoods right now that is preventing them from entering them?
So like things like rent controls actually drive up the cost of rent in non-rent controlled apartments, which makes it empirically worse and drives lower income people.
But let's look to
this is from the
St.
Stanford study from McQuaid, which you also know.
Right, but let's look to St. Louis, right?
Yeah,
in
but-
St. Louis, these neighborhoods were left behind. The poor ones and the rich ones were just built up and gentrified.
So
Why are they?
let's look to the McQuaid evidence, which looks at the entire country. They found that if you lived in a city with rent controls and your apartment was not under rent control, your rent increased by 5.1%.
Okay, and then what is the reason for this increase in rents because of rent controls?
So like when you have regulation, they are incentivized to do anything they can to make up for lost profits.
But these people are always trying to make the most money. When a
But-
developer's out there
so-
making profit, developers are profit
We would
driven.
say-
The government is driven by helping the people.
We would say that the problem is that in
Wait,
the calm
Michael,
world is where you're having all
so if
this
the government
luxury
is driven by helping the people, why are they not investing in places that need investment like Castle Hill, which need $23 million in repairs?
Right, what we see is that it's just not like feasible to do it right now. Like, right, but if you
So
promote
the-
market
If the
Why would
government's
it ever
supposed
be
to help the
feasible?
people, why aren't they doing it?
if you get rid of the regulations on these people, it gets even worse because there's no affordable units. What we see is in the status quo, we're able to have some, which is helping the status helping. There's no reason because we can't help everyone, we can't help some of
Yeah,
them. That's the most important thing to look at. In
Chicago is trying to save 6,000 other units, but it's becoming more difficult for it to do so. And like if you affirm right now, it like accelerates this process because they have to take a hands-off approach to this. This deregulation completely destroys their ability to protect these 6,000 units.
The private market's always going to be driven
You guys
by
have
profits.
Okay.
Oh,
9 seconds.
There's
How's
like-
your guys' day going?
Hey, we'll have the question. How is your day going?
it's going fantastic. There's 4 more seconds left. How's your day going?
It's going pretty well.
Great. We're on our last 23. Now.
Okay. So first, we're going to talk about the good old definition argument really briefly. It's going to go down their case why you don't vote for them, the 2 voter issues why you do vote for us. Partner ready?
Yes.
Opponents ready?
Yep.
And all 5 judges ready? First, let's start with the definition. We tell you that market rate housing removes the regulations that affect the fair market rent. These are things like rent controls. Claims that it removes all regulations from my opponents is completely illogical. No other place has done this. It's nonsensical. What you can extend is the net offense I read at the top of my rebuttal, extended through summary that they never respond to. Public housing is the alternative, and there will never be enough public housing to solve. Their first contention is a reason to vote for us. This is because they never respond to Bertolet in 2016, which tells you that you decrease property values, increasing access for lower income. But second, you can weigh this on the real world impact that the majority of affordable housing in the status quo has been market rate housing that has become cheaper over time. That's a clean reason to prefer a pro ballot. Next, let's talk about their second contention is also reason to vote for us. The first is that the majority of public housing, 90%, is same or cheaper price as those already offered by the local market. Market rate housing is more effective because we also give you 13 times the units. For every one public unit saved, you lose 13 market rate. We achieve supply and affordability. You can vote for us off of their case. The first voter issue is going to be cost. We give you 3 different reasons to prefer cost with a pro ballot, 0 responded to. But also they say it's predominantly luxury. This completely ignores the fact that the reason it's luxury is because overregulation drives up the cost by 40%. What they also don't respond to is the fact that when you put in regulations, you see a decline in the amount of units put for rent, 15% by the Stanford McQuaid evidence. First, we outweigh on scope because we are increasing housing access, and second, we stop this cycle of structural violence that's the cleanest way to enact ballot. The second voter issue is going to be poverty. They say that subsidized units are the way to escape the poverty trap. The opposite is true. Their response is uncarded and unwarranted. We specifically explain that public and subsidized housing is deteriorating and lacking in any opportunity. Because it is further away from the city center, you see your job opportunities drop by 3 to 5 times. This is what is keeping people trapped in an endemic cycle of poverty on their side. When you vote pro, you solve this because of the NREI evidence, which they also don't respond to, that tells you that there's going to be an increased investment in lower price point properties, literally properties for the lower income. A vote for pro is the development of affordable housing. Thank you, and for these reasons, I urge you to vote pro.
We'll use our remaining 58 seconds. Back to the off-time roadmap, and we're going over a couple of key issues and then moving on and elaborating on the 2 voting issues Bill brought up. Bill, you ready?
Yeah.
My opponents ready?
Yep.
Guys, you ready? Last time, let's begin. Starting off the top of the inclusionary zoning idea, they talk about how we're going to only get rid of regulations, don't let them cherry pick. Inclusionary zoning is inherently anti-market rate because it forces people to build affordable housing, not market rate housing. You're going to lose their only access to affordable housing. The second thing you look at is their McQuaid card. They talk about this idea, but understand they provided no rationale behind this card. They only talk about how there's increase in prices of other places. There's no causation in this card, only correlation. First voting issue is making renovations unaffordable. You're going to flow through our Florida card showing that these units are ultra luxury. This is warranted through our Flanagan card showing there's limited land area, and our other warrant showing that these increased prices of the buildings is what increases the price. The Harvard card shows that this is going to happen despite the idea of demand, because no matter how much demand there is, they're going to keep building luxury because that's how they make money. The Badger card shows that in these Chicago, LA, New York, Washington, these subsidized units are being converted to market rate. By voting pro, you lose even more affordable units than in the status quo. And the filtering, the idea they talked about, doesn't happen because when you promote market rate, it slows down and is mitigated completely. The Journal of Foreign Affairs card impacts this through the homelessness idea because a $100 increase in rents is associated with 15% increase in homelessness. You're going to weigh this against their first voting issue about cost. They talk about the regulations increase cost, but you're going to look holistically. The idea of making just luxury units is going to be more costly than a slight increase in the affordable, which is cost, which is already more affordable than the luxury units themselves. We're on risk because there's a high risk of homelessness with a pro ballot because they're only making luxury units and nothing to help the poor. The second voting issue is segregation and inequality. Flow through our Anzalone card showing that the poor black neighborhoods are being largely vacant and lacking investment. They talk about deregulating. This deregulation causes there to be nothing to protect the poor people. The luxury units are going to just crowd them out and make them homeless. Then the Larry Moore card showing the bottom bottom 20% has only $500 left after necessities to pay rent. When you increase rents because of these luxury apartments, this is going to cause these people to have no money left for necessities. This is what drives them displacement. This is what drives them into homelessness. When it's against their voting issue about poverty, they link poverty comes from affordable housing. The affordable housing they have no access to, and you're going to flow through our 2 warrants again. We want a magnitude because we're going to be helping the most people by actually providing affordable housing to all citizens instead of just making luxury units for the top. If market rate housing were affordable, it'd be called affordable housing. For these reasons, we can only see a $10.